My name is Elaine Mercer, and I was 64 years old the spring my brother told me to relax about the will. At the time, I honestly thought he was right. My mother had passed only 2 weeks earlier, and I was exhausted, emotionally, mentally, and physically. I wasn't thinking about inheritances or documents. I was thinking about the smell of her lavender lotion still lingering on the quilt she'd made, the one folded at the foot of her bed like she would return any moment to straighten it. Life had been quiet for me that year. I lived alone in a little gray house on the edge of Willow Creek, where retirement had granted me slow mornings, a garden I adored, and evenings spent reading by lamplight. I'd always been the steady child, the one who stayed, the one who helped, the one who answered every call. My brother, Dennis, had been the opposite. A thunderstorm of charm and irresponsibility, he blew in only when he needed something and vanished whenever anyone needed him. Still, after our mother's funeral, he'd shown up with coffee, pastries, and what seemed like genuine sibling warmth. We sat on my porch as he patted my hand and told me he had everything handled. I remember looking at him, your classic silver fox in his late 50s, expensive jeans, that cologne that always arrived a second before he did, and thinking maybe grief had softened him. When I asked about the will, he laughed. Not cruelly, but with that breezy dismissal he'd perfected. "Lainey, relax. Mom took care of us both. I've already talked to the executor. You don't need to stress about anything. I've got it under control." I believed him because believing was easier. But even then, foreshadowing had begun to settle around me like a cold mist. Little things. A locked file cabinet suddenly empty. Letters I'd seen on my mother's desk now missing. The executor, Mr. Toombs, sounding oddly cautious when I called to confirm our meeting. And then there was the way Dennis kept touching his phone whenever I mentioned Mom's house. He'd say, "Don't worry about it," and glance down, as if expecting a message. I should have listened to my intuition. 64 years on this earth had taught me that when someone tells you, and only you, to relax about money, it usually means they're already pocketing something in the dark. But I didn't know that yet. I didn't know that the inheritance I assumed would be simple and shared fairly was about to tear open a truth so deep and long buried that I wondered how any of us ever lived without noticing it. And I certainly didn't know that the moment the executor read my share, my brother's mask, thin as rice paper, would finally split, revealing the betrayal he'd been orchestrating for months, maybe years. That revelation was still ahead of me, trembling at the edge of my everyday life like thunder before a storm. What I felt then was only a vague sense of unease, like the floor beneath me had started to tilt ever so slightly. And I had no idea how far I was about to fall. The day of the will reading arrived with a gray sky the color of wet slate. I remember it because I'd always had a superstition that weather echoed emotion, and the air felt thick enough to chew. I drove to the attorney's office alone, Dennis claiming he'd probably run a bit late, but to go on ahead. Typical. The lobby smelled of lemon polish and old carpet, the kind of sterile place where families walk in bound together and walk out fractured. I sat in a stiff chair, smoothing my skirt, trying to ignore the tight knot forming beneath my ribs. At 10 sharp, the door opened. "Ms. Mercer?" It was Mr. Toombs, thin as a scarecrow, glasses perched precariously low on his long nose. He always looked like a man who had read far too many secrets. Inside his office sat 2 chairs. Only one was occupied. Dennis wasn't there. I felt a flicker of irritation, but before I could voice it, the door swung open again and he breezed in. Breathless. Smiling. Wearing a jacket I knew cost more than my monthly pension. "Sorry, traffic," he said, though his cheeks weren't flushed and his hair wasn't wind-tossed. He took the other seat, offered the executor a too-wide grin, then flashed me a wink as if we were in on something together. We weren't. The reading began simply. Funeral expenses. Minor debts. Personal items. Then, Mom's house. The lake cabin. The joint savings account she'd always said would be split evenly. When the executor cleared his throat before continuing, I felt my stomach drop. Per the updated will, executed 4 months prior to Mrs. Mercer's passing, he said, the primary residence is to be transferred solely to Mr. Dennis Mercer. My breath caught. I turned toward my brother. He didn't look at me. He was checking his watch. The cabin, Toombs continued, is also to go to Mr. Dennis Mercer. My pulse thrummed in my ears. The cabin? The one my mother promised to me since childhood? The one she said would be mine because I loved it enough to maintain it? No. Something was wrong. As for the savings account, here came the final blow. It is to be transferred entirely to Mr. Dennis Mercer. The room blurred. Warmth drained from my hands. I heard myself inhale, slow and shaky, like someone stabilizing herself at the edge of a cliff. And Miss Elaine? I whispered. The executor shifted, uncomfortable. You are left a box of personal effects your mother designated. A box. A box. My brother finally looked at me then, wearing a starched stiff smile that didn't reach his eyes. Lainey, don't make this weird. There are moments in life when betrayal is so clean, so shockingly surgical, it doesn't feel like pain at first. It feels like numbness. Silence. A suspended disbelief, as though your brain refuses to process the blow. I stared at him, my brother, my only sibling, the boy I'd shared a room with growing up, the man I defended our entire lives, and felt something inside me dislodge. Not anger. Not yet. A slow understanding. An awakening. Because the will was wrong. My mother would never have structured it this way. And if Dennis had insisted I relax, perhaps it was because he'd needed time to do something irreversible. And I would find out exactly what. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in my kitchen, wrapped in a worn cardigan, replaying the reading over and over until the words felt like bruises blooming across my chest. A box of personal effects. The phrase tasted like dust. To understand the depth of my hurt, you'd need to understand my mother. She wasn't wealthy, but she was generous with what she had. She raised Dennis and me alone after our father walked out when I was 9 and Dennis was 5. I became the helper child, the caretaker. I scheduled appointments, cooked dinners, soothed tantrums, sometimes Dennis's more than my own. By adulthood, our roles were set in stone. I stayed close. He drifted. I helped our mother through every surgery, every flare-up of arthritis, every lonely holiday. He appeared for celebrations, not caregiving. And yet, she loved him with a softness that sometimes made me ache. She always believed he would turn around, settle down, mature. He never did. Years later, when Mom grew frail, I visited daily. Dennis visited occasionally, then less, then not at all. But every time he did come by, she lit up like a girl at a dance, thrilled that her charming son still had room for her in his glossy, self-involved world. I never resented her for it. Love isn't always rational. It doesn't need to be. But revisiting those memories now, I began to see the cracks. The way Dennis always hovered around her desk when he visited. The way she whispered once, "He's under so much pressure, Lainey," after he asked her for money she didn't have. The way she defended him whenever I tried to address his behavior. Maybe she'd been too trusting. Maybe he'd been too desperate. And maybe, months before she died, while her medication was high and her cognition was low, he'd slipped something under her pen that she didn't fully understand. But motive was the simplest part of all. Dennis was broke. Always had been. He lived behind illusions, nice clothes, expensive meals, trendy condos rented month to month. And illusions cost money. Money he didn't have. Money he thought should rightfully be his. Money he believed our mother owed him for loving him unconditionally. I realized something else, too. 4 months before Mom passed, Dennis had suddenly started visiting her frequently. He'd told me it was because he wanted to be a better son. At the time, I'd been touched. Now, I saw the truth. He wasn't being a better son. He was preparing the ground. Planting seeds. Positioning himself. And if he'd truly tampered with her will, then he had exploited the one person who trusted him more than anyone else in the world. That was cruelty. That was betrayal. And that was something I could not, would not, let stand. My mother raised me to be gentle. But she also raised me to be just. And justice, when done quietly and truthfully, has a way of finding its mark. The next morning, I made tea and opened the only thing the will had left me, the beige cardboard box with my name written in my mother's handwriting, shaky but familiar. Inside were photo albums, her rosary, a silk scarf, and at the very bottom, an envelope labeled simply, "For Elaine." My heart hammered as I opened it. Inside was a single sheet of paper, Mom's handwriting, soft loops and slanted letters. "Lainey, keep these safe." These? What these? I checked the envelope again. Nothing else. Except, when I tilted it, something hard slid behind the lining. I tore the bottom seam carefully, and a USB drive fell into my palm. My breath caught. My mother had barely used email, let alone USB drives. Whatever was on it, someone had helped her save it. And I knew exactly who wouldn't have. I didn't plug it in immediately. Instead, I drove to my mother's house, the house Dennis now believed was legally his. I still had a key. He hadn't changed the locks yet, likely because he was waiting for the legal paperwork to clear, or because he assumed I was too defeated to step foot inside again. Inside, everything smelled faintly of cinnamon and dust, a scent that hit me so hard my knees weakened. I walked slowly to her old desk. The drawers were neater than I remembered. Too neat. My mother had been many lovely things, but organized wasn't one of them. Someone, Dennis, had cleaned through her things recently. But he hadn't cleaned well enough. In the bottom drawer, beneath stacks of receipts, I found a folder labeled Will, Old Versions. Inside were 3 printed wills from over the years. All 3 divided assets evenly. All signed. All notarized. My pulse quickened. Why would she suddenly change everything, right before she died? I searched the bedroom next, then the hall closet. And there, wedged between linens, I found a spiral notebook. On the first page was a dated entry in her handwriting. Dennis brought forms today. Said they were insurance papers. He insisted I sign quickly. I was tired. Maybe I'll look at them tomorrow. Insurance papers. He'd lied to her. On another page. Should ask Elaine to look at those forms. They didn't feel right. I felt sick. My mother hadn't updated her will, not intentionally. And she'd wanted me to check. But she never got the chance. My hands trembled as I held the notebook. In that moment, everything aligned, the timing, the sudden changes, Dennis's anxiety whenever I mentioned legal matters. He had taken advantage of her confusion. He had manipulated her. And he had done so using legal paperwork she trusted. That USB drive in my purse suddenly felt radioactive. That night, at home, I plugged it into my laptop. There were 3 files. 1 audio recording. 1 scanned document. 1 video. I clicked the audio first. My mother's voice, frail, wavering. "Elaine, if you're hearing this, something happened. Please check the dates." He said it was just paperwork. My breath froze. I clicked the scanned document next. It was the updated will, and signed. And signed. My hands flew to my mouth. But the video, that was the file that changed everything. My mother sat in her living room, time-stamped 3 months before her death. She looked confused. Distressed. "I don't think what Dennis asked me to sign was right," she said, staring into the camera. I didn't understand. "I want Elaine to see everything. I trust her." My vision blurred with tears. My mother had tried to protect me, and herself. And she had left me the truth. Now I just needed to use it. I spent the next 3 days assembling the pieces as meticulously as a surgeon preparing for operation. No assumptions. No leaps. Only evidence. The unsigned will file's metadata showed it had been opened and edited repeatedly, from Dennis's laptop. That alone wouldn't stand in court, but the video and notebook entries would. Still, something nudged me, I needed one more piece. One final confirmation. So, I requested copies from the county clerk of all notarized documents my mother had filed in the last year. When the clerk handed me the folder, my hands tingled with dread. There it was. The final will Dennis had presented. The notarization date fell squarely on the day my mother had written in her notebook, Dennis brought forms today. But the signature didn't match the others. Not exactly. Close, but more angular. More tremor than curve. It took only an hour to get a handwriting expert to look at the samples. He wasn't allowed to formally testify without a fee, but he could give his opinion. This isn't natural deterioration, he said. This looks copied. Possibly traced. I felt the anger then, not hot or loud, but cold and crystalline. Anger that steadied my breathing instead of hastening it. Dennis had forged our mother's signature. And he'd bullied her into signing something else, something unrelated, to distract her. Documents she'd believed were insurance papers. My mother had sensed something. She'd tried to warn me. But Dennis had moved faster. I gathered everything, video file, notebook scans, metadata screenshots, old wills, the expert's informal notes, and placed them inside a new folder labeled simply, Truth. I wasn't going to scream. I wasn't going to break down. I wasn't going to confront him with emotion. I was going to confront him with facts. Truth, delivered quietly, lands harder than rage. And mine was ready. I invited Dennis to my home under the pretense of wanting to talk things through peacefully. He arrived wearing that same casual confidence that had fooled too many people for too long. "Lainey," he said, opening his arms like he expected a hug. "I'm glad you're being reasonable." I stepped aside without returning the gesture. "Come in." He walked into my living room, glancing around, noting, perhaps, the quiet order, the tidy coffee table where a single folder sat. When he sat, I joined him, folding my hands calmly. "I'm going to show you something," I said. "And then you're going to tell me the truth." He smirked. "Elaine, if this is about the will, we've been over this." "Mom." I pressed play on the video. My mother's frail face filled the screen. Her voice trembled with fear. "I don't think what Dennis asked me to sign was right." Dennis's smirk vanished. His color drained. His jaw locked so tight a vein pulsed in his temple. "Where did you get that?" he whispered. "She left it for me," I said. "Along with her notebook. Along with the unsigned will you edited on your laptop. Along with the old wills showing she always intended things to be split evenly." He stood abruptly. "You don't know what you're talking about." "Sit down," I said, using the same voice our mother used when we were children. He froze. "You exploited her confusion. You lied to her about documents. You forged her signature. You manipulated a dying woman." His eyes flickered, anger, panic, calculation. "You can't prove anything," he muttered. I slid the folder across the table. "I can prove everything." He stared at it like it might explode. "You're going to call the executor," I said. "And you're going to correct the record. You will revoke the fraudulent will. You will reinstate the previous one. And you will do it voluntarily, because if I take this to court, not only will you lose everything, you may face criminal charges." He swallowed hard. "You'd ruin me," he said softly. "No," I replied. "You ruined yourself the moment you chose greed over family." For a long moment, the room was silent except for his ragged breathing. Then his shoulders slumped. "What do you want?" he whispered. "The truth," I said. "Restored publicly. Fully. Permanently. His eyes closed. Fine. And just like that, the deception cracked open. The executor was stunned when Dennis arrived the next morning with me beside him. His voice shook as he confessed everything, how he'd altered the will, how he'd pressured our mother, how he'd substituted pages and manipulated dates. Mr. Toombs listened, pale and grave. Legal steps moved swiftly from there. The fraudulent will was invalidated. The prior version, equal distribution, was reinstated. The house, the cabin, the savings, all divided fairly just as our mother had wanted. But consequences don't end with legalities. Word spread through town. Dennis's reputation, already fragile, shattered. The business partner who had always vouched for him quietly dissolved their arrangement. Friends who enjoyed his charm vanished when they sensed scandal. And though I didn't revel in his downfall, I didn't shield him from it either. Justice doesn't require cruelty. Only truth. Dennis avoided me for weeks. When he finally came to return the key to Mom's house, he looked older. Smaller. I didn't think you'd fight me, he said quietly. I replied with equal quiet, that was your first mistake. He nodded, unable to meet my gaze. Are you going to hate me forever? No, I said. But I won't trust you again. He accepted it with a slow, pained exhale. Some lessons are learned late. Some are learned the hard way. And some are learned only when the person you tried to deceive refuses to collapse. In the months that followed, life softened again. I kept the cabin, my mother's favorite place, and spent weekends there restoring the garden she used to adore. Her video, her notebook, her voice, these were no longer burdens. They were gifts. Proof that even in her confusion, she trusted me. I didn't pursue charges against Dennis. Not because he deserved mercy, but because I deserved peace. And peace doesn't grow well in soil watered with vengeance. But accountability? That is always worth pursuing. One quiet evening at the cabin, I sat on the porch watching the sun settle behind the water, and I understood something: justice isn't loud. It doesn't always come with courtroom drama or raised voices. Sometimes it arrives as stillness. As clarity. As truth finally surfacing. My mother had wanted fairness. And fairness, in the end, prevailed. If you've listened to my story, take this with you: when someone tells you to relax about the will, that's the exact moment you should start paying attention. Not with paranoia. With awareness. With documentation. With quiet strength. Because truth, when gathered patiently, becomes its own kind of revenge. And redemption, well, that comes afterward, in the peace you earn by standing firm. Thank you for hearing my story. If you'd like more, I'm always here to tell the next one.